So, let me ask you a question. What is it that some of the top engineers and producers in the industry today know about using EQ that you know also, but probably don't realize you know it? Stay tuned. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are out there in YouTube land. Welcome back to FX Studio 2. I am G Sharp Jams, and today we're going to be talking about EQ, in particular the Rupert Neve 551 Inductor EQ. But before I get started, I want to give you a short story and a little bit of history about how things evolve and how we become accustomed to doing certain things and how we need to start thinking outside of the box and how this is going to apply to using our EQ. So to begin, just bear with me here, and I promise you I'm going to get to the point. Way back when I was a youngster, I grew up with 10 TV channels, no internet, and no social media. That's what we had. Today, the younger generation has TikTok, they have Instagram, they have YouTube, they have the World Wide Web, they have over 1,000 channels on their TV sets. They've got it all. That's all they know. That's what they grew up with. Me, I grew up with going to the library to doing my research for a term paper or anything I had to get done for school. Today's generation, all they have to do is Google it, and it's right there for them, and they can use that information, although I know some of the teachers and professors still encourage you to go to the library and do your research. But that's where we are today. We have become so accustomed to the easy way and so accustomed to the way things just generally are. And for the younger generation, again, that's all they know. They don't know about pre-internet days. They don't know about pre-social media days. This is their world that they live in. Now, what in the world does that have to do with EQ? Very simple. I'm going to get there in just a second. My point is, again, that we become so accustomed to the way that we do things as audio engineers because of the way the product is marketed to us, or because of the way we've heard that it should be used, or the way that this person is using it and that person is using it, so that's the way I should be using it. And you become so accustomed to doing that we forget that there are other capabilities, functionalities, possibilities, and options that we can use with the equipment that we have. In particular, equalization. Now, to get to the point, when using EQ, we think about EQ as a tool that can either cut or boost frequencies, the low frequencies, the mid frequencies, and the high frequencies. And that's absolutely correct. That's exactly what it does. However, it does so much more than that if you think about it. As an example, let's think about reverb for a second. What does reverb do? Reverb adds depth and space to our sound. It takes a sound or an instrument and it stretches it across the spectrum, the sound spectrum, or brings things back closer together, or pulls things further apart and brings them towards the back of the mix, or it brings things towards the front of the mix. It creates echo, it creates space, and it creates depth. Think about something. Can't we do the same thing using EQ? We've become so accustomed to thinking about depth and space and going to that reverb module or even that delay module. But we forget that we've got EQ as a tool as well to use to create space and depth. Now, when you think about EQ, the first thing you think about, of course, again, is cutting frequencies or boosting frequencies. But the thing about EQ also is that you have the highs, which are going to either add or cut edginess to a sound, or add or cut airiness to a sound, especially with vocals. On the mids, it controls the warmth of the sound. You can either make it warmer or you can make it a little bit cooler. That's what mids do. And on the low frequencies, we can adjust the bottom, making things thicker and sound a little bit louder and more fuller. That's how we perceive what an EQ does. But if you think about EQ for a moment, and this is why I love the 551, when you think about EQ for a moment, what are you doing with those frequencies? You're taking those frequencies and moving them around in space. You're taking the low end and you're boosting it up, or you're taking the low end and bringing it down. And at the same time, you're doing the same thing with the high ends, and you're doing the same thing with the low ends, with the mids rather. We can either use a peak, or we can use a shelf. On both sides, with a shelf and with the peak, we can make it nice and narrow, or we can make it wider. That's what EQ does. Now, with all this shaping going on with the different frequencies and moving frequencies around, and then using different peaks with different cues, or using shelves and adjusting the slope of the shelf, if we have that capability with the module that we have, aren't we creating depth and space using that EQ? Reverb is going to give us depth and space control over an entire sound. EQ is going to give us depth and space with individual frequencies. Think about that for a second and wrap your head around that. And again, like I said, this is why I love the 551, because of all the functionality that it has. Let's take a closer look at the 551. I'll go through the different steps and show you all the different functionality there. And as I go through, I'll explain to you exactly what each does and how you use those to create depth and space. Okay, so here we have the Rupert Neve 551 Inductor EQ. Next to that, I have a pair of 535s, and I've got the 542 and the 511 next to that. We're going to focus in on this 551, however. And excuse the blinking lights. I'm actually mastering something right now, so while I'm speaking, I'm letting that run. But here we are, the Rupert Neve 551. Now, let's take a closer look at the different functionalities that we have with this particular module. And again, please bear with me. I'm using my hand to hold my camera, so if it's a little bit shaky, I do apologize. But let's go ahead and get started. Here, at the very top of the 551, we have the adjustments for the gain, and we can either turn that up or we can turn it down. Next to that, we have the button which we select, which either takes the EQ in or takes the EQ out. And just below that, we have the frequencies for the mid-range that we can choose. And we have 6 different frequencies that we can choose there. Just below the gain button here, we have a choice of either 8K or 16K as the frequency that we're choosing on the high end. And then we also have this peak. Now, the peak button gives us the ability to either change that from a peak or a shelf on the high end. And that is a very, very powerful tool. And we'll be talking about more of that a little bit later and exactly how you can use that for sound design. Just below that, we have the gain knob for the mid frequencies here. And then we have this, which I'm going to come back to because I love this particular functionality of the 551, this mid frequency high Q. It is outstanding what you can do with it. Just below that, we have the frequencies for the mid-range, which we can check. And we have the low frequency, which also gives us the choice of either a peak or a shelf, simply by pressing the button. And then below that, we have a high-pass filter, which is set at 80 hertz, and that, I believe, is a 12 dB slope on that. It is a 12 dB slope on that high-pass filter. And then just next to that, we have the gain control for the low end. Now, wanted to go back and talk about this MF high Q button that we see right here. If we engage this, this gives us a proportional, and that word is very important. It is a proportional Q. And that proportional Q adjusts itself according to how much we cut or boost the gain. Very, very important. It's almost like, and I stress the word almost like, working as if it were a dynamic EQ button. But it is proportional to the gain of, or the boost or the cut of the gain that you're using. So it adjusts itself within the mids. So those mids are actually fluctuating by using that button. Very, very powerful. This is the 551 and all the functionality. I'm going to switch back now and let's talk a little bit more about sound design and using this 551 to create space and depth. Okay, so we are back and we're going to discuss using EQ to create space and depth. And as I mentioned previously, before I showed you the 551 sitting in my rack behind me, 551 gives you the ability to either select a shelf on the high or the low or a peak on the high or the low. And we have that mid-high Q, which adjusts itself according to the boost or the cut that you're using on that mid frequency, which is very powerful. Think about it again. If we have the ability to take frequencies and adjust them in different positions throughout the mix, what are we doing? Aren't we creating space? Especially with the peaks. We can widen the peak or we can close the peak up. We can take that shelf and we can move that shelf around a little bit, whatever we want to do with it. We're creating space and depth with frequencies. This becomes especially powerful when you're working with sound design or where you're working with special effects. Because think about this. Now, this isn't particularly something that you would want to use on a pop song or a ballad. That should be pretty straightforward, although you can experiment and try it and see what you come up with. However, if you're doing sound design or if you're doing special effects, using EQ and moving those frequencies around and moving those peaks and those shelves around, bringing up the bottom, bringing down the bottom, bringing up the highs, bringing down the lows, playing around with those mids, while things are happening, creates fluctuation in the sound. Now, do that same thing while you're working with reverb. If you haven't tried it, try it. You might be amazed at what you come up with. Using reverb and fluctuating that reverb a little bit and moving around those frequencies with an EQ both at the same time can give you some truly amazing results. And I promise you, some of those sci-fi movies that you've watched and some of those crazy movies with the THD and the Dolby Atmos and all those other things, they're doing this. They know the secret. You can't overdo it like everything else, everything in moderation, but you got to try it and experiment with it. Because that, my friends, as I like to say, is audio engineering. It's all about experimentation and try something different. See what you come up with. Hope this helped. I'll be back with another video soon. We're going to take a look at a DBX module that happens to be one of my favorites that I use as a high frequency compressor. It's actually the DBX de-esser. However, we can use de-essers to help us tame those high frequencies and use them as high frequency compressors. We'll talk about that in the next video. Until then, have a great rest of your day and keep creating G-Sharp Jams out.
Awesome.